What really happened behind the scenes during the construction of the World Trade Center? The story goes far deeper than steel and concrete. David Rockefeller stood at the center of Lower Manhattan's future, convinced that only bold action could reverse the district's decline. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he saw opportunity where others saw decay. In the early 1960s, Rockefeller gathered the city's most powerful business leaders and formed the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, called DLMA. Their mission was clear: transform Lower Manhattan into a global headquarters for commerce and finance. Rockefeller's vision was not just about new buildings. In speeches and private letters, he described New York as the gateway to the world and called for a monumental trade center to restore American confidence. A 1961 letter to President Kennedy outlined the stakes. The United States needed to project prosperity abroad, and New York was the stage. The DLMA's public statements echoed this language, promising a project that would bring together government agencies and international business under one roof. Behind closed doors, the DLMA operated as more than a booster club. It became Rockefeller's lobbying engine, connecting the family's banking interests to city government, labor leaders, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The association's reports and press releases painted the World Trade Center as the anchor for a new Lower Manhattan, a plan to reclaim the city's economic might after years of jobs and residents fleeing to the suburbs. Rockefeller believed that only a project of unprecedented scale could halt the exodus and set a new course for the city's future. The Port Authority, with its unique status as a bi-state agency, offered the perfect institutional partner. Its board minutes from 1961 and 1962 reveal a shared language with the DLMA. Phrases like urban renewal, regional gateway, and tax base expansion filled the official record. Executive Director Austin Tobin, a close Rockefeller ally, championed the World Trade Center as a model of modern administration, one that could bypass the usual political gridlock and deliver results at scale. The DLMA's influence reached deep into city and state politics. Rockefeller's team lobbied for special financing tools, including tax-exempt bonds and cross-state revenue streams that would shield private investors from risk. Port Authority press releases announced plans to acquire, develop, and manage a vast tract of land in Lower Manhattan, with the stated goal of serving the public good. But the real power lay in the ability to act without direct approval from voters or city officials. The authority's legal autonomy allowed it to seize land, issue bonds, and negotiate deals behind closed doors. As the plans advanced, critics accused the DLMA and the Port Authority of privileging elite interests over the needs of existing communities. But Rockefeller's rhetoric never wavered. In public forums and media interviews, he insisted that the World Trade Center would secure New York's place at the center of global commerce. He described the towers as a symbol of American ingenuity, a project that would inspire confidence at home and abroad. This campaign set in motion a chain of events that would reshape Lower Manhattan. The institutional muscle of the DLMA, combined with the Port Authority's sweeping powers, created a lopsided contest. On one side stood the city's most influential financiers and planners. On the other, a patchwork of merchants and residents whose futures would soon be decided in boardrooms and back channels. The promise of a new world hub was clear, but the cost to those in its path was only beginning to come into focus. On the narrow streets between Cortlandt and Greenwich, the hum of commerce once filled every doorway. This was Radio Row, a dense patchwork of electronics shops, repair stalls, and wholesalers. For decades, it had been the heart of New York's radio industry, a place where a single block could hold 100 businesses, each with its own loyal customers and family behind the counter. In the early 1960s, that world began to unravel. Oscar Nadell, owner of Oscar's radio shop at 63 Cortlandt Street, became the voice of the merchants. He led the Downtown West Businessmen's Association, gathering shop owners in crowded back rooms to share legal updates and the latest rumors. When the Port Authority posted its first condemnation notices, Nadell called a meeting of nearly 300 merchants. The message was blunt. Their livelihoods were being seized for a project they had no say in, and the city offered little more than a relocation payment of $3,000. For most, that sum did not even cover moving costs, let alone the loss of inventory, loyal customers, or decades of sweat equity. Oral histories from the New York City Municipal Archives capture the shock and anger of those days. Shopkeepers describe the arrival of official envelopes, legal language announcing that title to their stores now belonged to the Port Authority. Some, like Irving Jaffe, who had run East Radio Store for over half a century, tried to fight in court. Others, such as Morton Brody of Morel Electronics, searched for new locations but found rents soaring and their customer base scattered. The Supreme Court declined to hear their appeal in November 1963, and the last legal roadblock vanished. Nadell organized protests that mixed grief with defiance. In July 1962, he led a mock funeral down Cortlandt Street, pallbearers carrying a coffin painted with the words, "Death of the Small Businessman." Newspapers captured families, many of them recent immigrants, standing in front of their shuttered storefronts. Some wrote desperate letters to city officials, while others, like delicatessen owner Barry Ray, even appealed to foreign governments, hoping someone would intervene. By the spring of 1966, demolition crews moved in. Over 16 acres, nearly 300 businesses, and an estimated 30,000 workers were swept away. The compensation offers remained unchanged. Most merchants received no tailored support, no assistance in relocating their specialized shops, and no chance to remain together as a community. The Port Authority promised a new Radio Row on West 45th Street, but the merchants who tried to regroup found themselves isolated and adrift. The loss was more than economic. Oral histories recall the breakup of families who had worked side by side for decades, the dispersal of immigrant networks that had built their lives in Lower Manhattan. Jean M. Brown, one of the few residents in the district, documented the destruction from her window before being evicted while pregnant. For many, the forced removal meant the end of a way of life that could not be rebuilt elsewhere. By the time the last shop closed, the streets that once buzzed with commerce stood silent, awaiting the machines that would dig deep into the earth. The city's promise of progress had come at the cost of a community erased from the map, its stories preserved only in memories and scattered archives. The land, now emptied, became the blank canvas for an engineering gamble that would test the limits of ambition and risk. Excavators began their descent into the earth at what would become the World Trade Center site, facing a challenge unlike any attempted in New York before. The plan called for a 70-foot deep foundation, a massive concrete box designed to hold back the Hudson River and protect the underground train lines. Engineers called it the bathtub. The method, borrowed from European dam construction, relied on a trench filled with bentonite slurry to keep the walls from collapsing, while workers set steel cages and poured concrete panel by panel around the perimeter. The pressure was constant, both from the river and from the project's timeline. Construction logs from July 1962 record a sudden surge, water levels beneath the site rising by 3 feet overnight. Pumps ran around the clock, moving thousands of gallons out every minute as crews reinforced the western wall with steel ribs. A breach here could have flooded the entire pit and set the project back by months, if not years. The incident forced a redesign of the dewatering system, adding $30 million to the budget and pushing the schedule to its limits. Site engineers described the anxiety of those days in interviews years later. One recalled standing at the edge of the excavation, watching the slurry bubble and the water creep higher, knowing that a single misstep could cost lives and bring the entire project to a halt. The foundation's success depended on a delicate balance. Concrete poured at exactly the right rate. Steel cages set before the mud could reclaim the trench, and constant vigilance for any sign of weakness. By the end of that summer, the breach was contained, but the memory lingered. The bathtub would eventually hold back the river, but only after months of improvisation and risk. Every hour spent fighting water seepage meant more pressure on the crews above, who would soon face their own hazards as the towers began to rise. The foundation, invisible beneath the city, set the tone for everything that followed. Ambition measured against danger, and progress bought at the edge of disaster. On the edge of the excavation, a different kind of risk took shape. The World Trade Center site drew thousands of workers from across the city and far beyond. Payroll ledgers from the late 1960s show that more than 70% of those hired were recent immigrants, men from Ireland, Italy, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and the Philippines. Many arrived with little English, few connections, and no guarantee of steady work. Most were hired through subcontractors on daily pay contracts, sometimes with no benefits and no promise of a job the next week. Union membership offered a slim layer of protection, but the reality was often harsher than the promises. A representative from the Laborers' International Union of North America, who kept the site's ledgers, later recalled the constant turnover. You'd see a man for a week, maybe two, then he'd be gone. Another would take his place by Monday. There was always a line at the gate. The site's subcontracting system made it easy for companies to cycle through crews, hiring day laborers for the most dangerous tasks, lugging rebar, pouring concrete, or working at dizzying heights on the steel frame. The records show the overwhelming majority of these workers were paid in cash at the end of each shift. For many, the only paperwork was a name on a ledger and a punch on a time card. Some had union cards, but others, especially the newest arrivals, did not. The union representative described the difficulty of tracking injuries or complaints. If a man got hurt, sometimes he'd just disappear. No paperwork, no follow-up. The job kept moving. Despite the outward show of union oversight, the power on the ground lay with the subcontractors. They controlled hiring, assignments, and pay. Workers who spoke up about safety or missing wages risked losing their spot to someone waiting outside the gate. The pressure to keep up with the schedule meant that corners were cut and warnings ignored. Many laborers, desperate to send money home or pay rent, accepted the dangers as part of the bargain. The workforce was a mosaic of hope and hardship. For every man who found steady work, there were others who cycled through injury, unemployment, or worse. The ledgers tell only part of the story. The rest is written in the memories of those who built the towers, often at great personal cost. Their vulnerability would soon have deadly consequences as the pace of construction accelerated and the hazards multiplied. Between 1967 and 1974, the World Trade Center site became a place where ambition collided with deadly risk. The official ledgers tell the story in numbers. 62 workers lost their lives while building the towers. Their names fill lines in union logs and city health department certificates, but their stories rarely reached the public. The majority were young men, many recent immigrants, hired for the most hazardous jobs, pouring concrete, scaling steel skeletons, or hauling rebar through clouds of dust. Falls from dizzying heights claimed nearly a third of those lives. Safety rails were often missing, and harnesses, when available, were sometimes ignored in the rush to meet deadlines. One worker, just 23, fell from a crane's boom and was gone before help could arrive. Another was crushed by a swinging steel beam, his death marked by a single line in a contractor's accident report. Cranes and heavy machinery brought their own dangers, responsible for almost 1 in 5 fatalities. Equipment failures, rushed repairs, and lapses in communication turned routine tasks into life or death gambles. Dust and toxic exposure took lives more slowly. 13% of the recorded deaths were attributed to respiratory failure or complications from inhaling fine particles. Asbestos, cement dust, and diesel fumes filled the air, settling in the lungs of men who had no choice but to keep working. For some, the symptoms began on the job. For others, the real cost would not become clear until years later. The impact of these deaths rippled far beyond the construction site. Each fatality meant a family left without a breadwinner. Widows and children received little more than condolences and, if they were lucky, a modest union benefit. The Port Authority's public statements celebrated progress and innovation, but the human cost was kept out of the spotlight. For the families, grief was compounded by silence. Some, with consent, have shared memories in oral histories, stories of fathers who never came home, of brothers lost to a project that promised a brighter future for the city but demanded everything from those who built it. The tally of 62 is not just a number. It is a ledger of loss, quietly maintained in the background as the towers rose. The pressure to deliver on schedule and under budget drove decisions at every level, sometimes at the expense of basic safety. As the project moved forward, questions lingered about how much risk was considered acceptable and who had the power to decide. The search for accountability would soon turn toward the forces that shaped every deal, every contract, and every shortcut taken on the path to completion. On paper, the World Trade Center's concrete contracts looked routine: massive pours, tight schedules, and a handful of firms competing for the work. But federal investigators later uncovered a hidden system operating beneath the surface. The Department of Justice traced the largest concrete supply contract to American Concrete Corporation, a company already under scrutiny for ties to the Genovese crime family. Internal Port Authority memos from 1970 show American Concrete underbidding its nearest rival by 15%, justifying the price gap with claims of a new aggregate blend. That explanation unraveled in grand jury testimony 5 years later, when a former plant manager admitted to substituting lower-grade stone and sand, saving the company millions while meeting only the bare minimum of structural standards. The financial impact was staggering. Department of Justice indictments and procurement audits estimate that mob-controlled contractors inflated the cost of concrete by at least $120 million over the course of the project. The pattern was simple. Contractors would bid low to win the contract, then overbill for materials, labor, and delivery. Kickbacks flowed through union officials and site foremen, who ensured that inspections stayed cursory and complaints never reached city regulators. Safety checks became a formality, skipped to keep the schedule moving and the concrete flowing. The consequences extended beyond the balance sheet. Occupational Safety and Health Administration logs from 1971 and 1972 show a spike in safety violations after the main concrete contract was awarded. Inspectors documented missing guardrails, exposed rebar, and rushed pours that left structural elements vulnerable. Workers reported being pressured to finish sections in half the recommended time, with little regard for proper curing or site safety. For the men on the ground, the mob's control meant not just lost wages and higher prices, but a daily gamble with their own lives. The material shortcuts taken in the name of profit would soon intersect with even more dangerous decisions about what was mixed into the concrete itself. As the towers climbed higher, the question of fireproofing became a matter of life and death for those on site. The original construction plan called for asbestos-based insulation sprayed onto every steel beam, a common industry choice in the 1960s, prized for its low cost and resistance to fire. Material specification sheets from 1969 list asbestos as the default, with millions of pounds ordered for the lower floors. At the time, few outside the scientific community understood the risks, but as the decade turned, new research began to cast a long shadow. Early studies from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health warned that airborne asbestos fibers could lodge deep in the lungs, triggering deadly diseases decades after exposure. Internal Port Authority correspondence from March 1970 reveals the moment the alarm reached management. A memo circulated among project supervisors stated, "Given recent NIOSH findings on asbestos fibers, we will limit use to the lower core where exposure is minimal. Alternative fireproofing will be explored for the upper floors." The decision was swift. No more asbestos above the 38th floor. From that point, contractors switched to mineral wool and other substitutes, but by then, the lower half of the towers had already been coated. Cost played a silent role in the reversal. Asbestos was cheap, and halting its use meant renegotiating contracts and absorbing higher material prices. For the workers tasked with spraying and trimming the insulation, the change came too late. Decades later, a cohort study of WTC construction workers revealed a threefold increase in mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer linked directly to asbestos exposure. Families of the afflicted described years of chronic illness, hospital visits, and unanswered questions about the air their loved ones breathed on the job. The towers would stand as a symbol of progress, but for those who labored in the dust and shadows, the price of that progress would be measured in sickness and silence. The internal memo that ended asbestos use above the 38th floor remains a quiet testament to a health compromise rooted as much in cost as in caution. As the project's finances drew new scrutiny, the consequences of every shortcut and reversal became harder to ignore. The original cost of the World Trade Center complex was pegged at $350 million in 1965, a figure that appeared ambitious but achievable for a public authority with its own revenue streams. The Port Authority's plan relied on tax-exempt revenue bonds, which allowed it to borrow at below-market rates while sidestepping the need for direct city or state funding. To further insulate the project from risk, a $100 million loan guarantee from the Federal Housing Administration was secured, shifting much of the financial burden away from private investors and onto the public. As construction advanced, the numbers began to spiral. Board minutes from 1969 and 1971 record a steady drumbeat of cost escalations, design changes, inflation, and unforeseen site conditions, all cited as justifications. The most dramatic increase followed the 1970 foundation crisis, when emergency waterproofing and structural fixes added $150 million to the budget almost overnight. By the time the towers opened in 1973, the final tally had soared past $900 million, more than 2.5 times the original estimate. Throughout this period, the Port Authority defended the overruns as necessary investments in regional infrastructure, emphasizing indirect benefits to airports, bridges, and ports. Congressional hearings in 1972 captured the divide. Officials described the excess as a public good, while critics labeled the arrangement a government-subsidized real estate gamble. The authority's structure made it difficult for outside observers to track exactly where the money went. State audits from 1974 uncovered a pattern of undocumented change orders and procurement shortcuts, with internal controls described as weak or non-existent. The lack of transparency left taxpayers uncertain about who was truly footing the bill, while private partners remained largely shielded from the consequences. The financial maneuvering behind the World Trade Center set the context for tough decisions about design, safety, and materials, choices that would shape the tower's legacy in ways that went far beyond the balance sheet. In 1968, an internal memo from a senior structural engineer landed on the desks of the World Trade Center's lead architects and project managers. The document raised a direct challenge to the celebrated tube frame design that had drawn headlines for its innovation. The engineer warned that relying almost entirely on the closely spaced exterior steel columns left the towers vulnerable if a section of the facade were ever breached. The memo urged the addition of reinforced concrete shear walls within the core, an extra layer of protection against both wind and catastrophic failure. It described specific scenarios where the loss of even a portion of the exterior columns could trigger a chain reaction, putting the entire structure at risk. But the recommendation was quietly set aside. Meeting notes from that year cite cost concerns and the pressure to keep floor plates open for tenants. The project's leadership assured stakeholders that the exterior tube and central steel core provided more than enough redundancy. No further action was taken. Years later, the same memo would resurface in debates among engineers and safety analysts, cited as an early warning that was ignored. At the time, however, the drive for efficiency and rentable space outweighed the dissent. The towers would rise as monuments to a bold new structural idea, but the questions raised by that 1968 memo lingered just beneath the surface, unaddressed as construction moved forward. In the spring of 1971, a memo from the World Trade Center's general contractor arrived on the desks of project supervisors. The warning was blunt. Crews had begun tightening the exterior tube frame bolts by hand, skipping the torque wrenches required by engineering specs. The shortcut saved time, but left the steel skeleton vulnerable to shifting under wind or load. OSHA inspectors, already on site to investigate a series of falls, logged the violation in their official reports. The citation described rows of bolts left loose or under-tightened, a risk that could undermine the integrity of entire floor sections. The pressure to keep pace with the schedule was relentless. Internal logs from that year show supervisors instructed foremen to sign off on completed sections even as punch lists of unfinished safety tasks grew longer. Workers, many paid by the day and eager to hold on to their jobs, rarely challenged the orders. Some recalled being told to move on. It's good enough as they climbed to the next floor. OSHA records from 1971 and 1972 document a pattern of repeated citations for missing guardrails, unprotected edges, and incomplete bolt checks. Each citation was closed with a promise to improve, then reissued as the same problems resurfaced weeks later. The contractor's memo, now preserved in the Port Authority archives, stands as evidence of a culture where expedience often trumped caution. The shortcuts taken in the name of progress were not isolated lapses, but part of a broader pattern that left the workforce exposed and the project's structural reliability in question. These warnings, buried in paperwork and rarely discussed in public, trace a direct line from the day-to-day realities of construction to the silent erasure of worker voices in the story of the towers. On April 4, 1973, dignitaries gathered at the base of the newly completed towers to cut a ribbon and declare the World Trade Center open. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Mayor John Lindsay, and Port Authority Chairman Austin Tobin stood before a wall of cameras, their speeches echoing with praise for the city's newest landmark. The official guest list included politicians, executives, and architects. But the men and women who had poured the concrete, bolted the steel, and risked their lives on the scaffolds, the workers, were nowhere to be found. Not a single labor representative stood alongside the city's elite. Press photographs from that day show the towers gleaming in the background, while the foreground is filled with suits and polished shoes. The workers' absence was not an oversight. It was policy. The Port Authority's invitations made no mention of the laborers or the families of the 62 who had died during construction. Newspapers the next morning reported on the spectacle, quoting officials who called the towers a triumph of American ingenuity. The stories did not mention the men who had fallen, the families left behind, or the daily dangers faced on the job. In the official narrative, the World Trade Center rose from the collective will of visionaries and planners. The hands that built it were left out of the story, their sacrifices consigned to silence. The omission lingered long after the applause faded, leaving a gap that would not be filled by any official monument or ceremony. Years passed before any public marker acknowledged the workers who lost their lives building the World Trade Center. For decades, their stories remained scattered in union ledgers and family memories, absent from official histories and ceremonies. It was not until the early 2000s that a small group of relatives, labor organizers, and historians began to press for recognition. They formed the Workers' Memorial Project, determined to honor the men whose names had vanished from the public record. Their efforts led to the installation of a modest bronze plaque at the edge of the 9/11 Memorial Plaza. The inscription lists the 62 workers who died during construction, not as a footnote, but as a central part of the site's legacy. The plaque stands apart from the main memorial, quietly bearing witness to a chapter long overlooked. For many families, it is the only public acknowledgement of their loss. Beyond the plaque, the New York Public Library now houses an oral history archive dedicated to the workers. These recordings capture voices that had gone unheard, stories of daily danger, pride in the work, and the grief that followed each fatal accident. The archive is open to all, offering a space where descendants and the public can listen, reflect, and remember. These grassroots memorials cannot erase the years of silence, nor can they fully restore what was lost. But they offer recognition where none existed before. They provide a small measure of justice and a reminder that the true cost of the towers lives on in the memories of those who built them. Cities still rise on the backs of unseen workers, and public ambition often eclipses private cost. The forces that shape the World Trade Center, political power, displacement, and risk, remain at play in urban development worldwide. As new skylines emerge, the real price is rarely on display. Remember, every landmark casts a shadow. What stories are we overlooking in today's triumphs? Let me know what you think in the comments below.